So it's not necessarily that there are particular one or certain aspects of it that are problematic, but to be honest, the entire thing in itself is problematic.
Is the curfew rational? Lockdown level 1 still has in place a curfew from 12 midnight until 5 a.m. And civil society group AfriForum is demanding transparency from the Minister of Cooperative Governance about the reasons for this rule. Joining me to discuss is AfriForum's legal representative, Daniël Eloff. Daniel, welcome back to the channel. Could you tell our viewers about the details of this application that you've made to Minister Dlamini-Zuma?
Well, David, quite simply that South Africans have a right to rational, informed, and proper, decent decision-making by the executive. And that's really the gist of this entire campaign in this potential court case. What we suspect is that, as we've seen with various other lockdown measures, that the minister simply has no reason to enforce a lot of these measures. They don't have any supporting data, supporting evidence to point to the fact that a curfew is an effective measure to combat the spread of COVID-19 or to mitigate the risk of spreading COVID-19. And all that we're asking is really quite simple: is provide us with, the documentation, the expert evidence, and all the stats that underlie your decision to continue with this curfew. We're sitting here 20 months into this national state of disaster, yet we still have a curfew, and nobody's quite sure why.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
Yeah, and earlier in the week, Daniel, we had Gabriel Krause of the Institute of Race Relations arguing for the dismantling of the National Coronavirus Command Council and an end to the state of disaster. And one of the arguments that he made was that is just a complete blanket on any information that informs the decision-making of these bodies and our COVID response. So I think that this is also a very good example of why we need much more transparency in terms of the decision-making around these regulations. So you've written to the minister. We're recording on Thursday, but this episode is released on Friday. And you've asked for her to respond. Have you received any response from the minister as yet?
So far, we haven't. And to be honest, and quite unfortunately, I don't expect a response. I've, during the past 20 months, sent, I think almost 4 or 5 dozen letters to the Minister of COGTA. And she is the one cabinet member who really simply refuses to respond to any correspondence, despite, I would say, the bona fides of my various clients approaching her. Oftentimes, it's not even threatening with litigation. It's simply asking for, a discussion and getting around a table to try and sort things out. But she simply refuses to do it. And if you contrast that with a bunch of other government entities and cabinet members who actually do respond, we often receive good responses from the Treasury, from the Minister of Finance, from the agricultural minister, but for some odd reason, the Minister of COGTA simply refuses. And what it does is it shrouds all her decision-making in, mystery. And she doesn't take South Africans into her confidence. And I think that leads to a bunch of South Africans being very skeptical of her decision-making, because she simply refuses to tell them and sort of take them on her thought process before she enacts any new regulation.
And Daniel, what are the next steps? Assuming you don't hear back from the minister, what avenues are you going to be exploring from that point?
So we have instruction to then approach the High Court in Pretoria to ask for this information. And it really is so simple. It astounds me that we're in a time where, some people wonder whether or not my client has a right to this information. But the point is, it's not just AfriForum that has the right to this information, it's all South Africans. AfriForum isn't acting on its own interest because it has some nefarious reason to get the information and the expert evidence on why the curfew is continuing. So all South Africans want to know, well, why is it in place? So if we don't receive the response by Friday, which we suspect we won't, then we will approach the court on an urgent basis to get that information.
But common sense suggests that there is no valid reason for having a curfew between 12 and 5 a.m. It doesn't really seem that stopping people from moving about is doing anything really to limit the spread of the virus. We're at historic low numbers of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. And people are congregating in other spaces during those other waking hours. So I'm not quite sure that there is a rational reason for that.
Yes, and that's entirely the point. South Africans have a right to rational decision-making and informed decision-making. And the point is, there might be a reason, right? And that's the entire why it's so frustrating is if there's a reason, simply provide it. If there's not a reason, then the decision isn't legitimate and it should be reviewed. And I mean, again, it's this open invitation to the Minister of COGTA to just give us the reasons if they're there, or if they're not, to admit it. And then, you know, the rest of the legal process can follow.
Yeah, and I think an essential component of a democratic society is transparency and accountability and being able to justify your actions. It's a very important part of the rule of law, is that laws and rules are justifiable and rational and also clear and transparent. But I think the lockdown has shown that there's a very high degree of capriciousness, arbitrariness around the implementation of rules. If we think of the restrictions on hot cooked chicken or open-toed sandals or banning online retail, it didn't really seem that these were rooted in any rational reasons.
No, and I mean, I think you could at least, well, I admit that initially it was difficult to sort of make informed decisions, right? It was a novel pandemic. And so I think a lot of South Africans are willing to excuse the sort of initial knee-jerk reaction, because you'd rather have an overreaction to this unknown pandemic than not do anything at all, especially as a government. But I mean, the point is, it's not May 2020 anymore, where chicken was banned and open-toed sandals were prohibited from being sold. We're sitting in November 2021. We're approaching the 2-year anniversary of this national state of disaster. And at this point, we really have an abundance of data on COVID-19. We know how it's spread. We know how deadly it is. We know how to treat it. We have we have various vaccines. So the decision-making should surely be different now when compared to, let's say, middle last year. And the fact that we're just perpetually still extending the very same state of disaster with the very same regulations, including the curfew, from March 2020 until November 2021, simply does not make sense. And if you don't have any supporting evidence by this time, then surely the decision should fall away.
And are there any other rules that you might consider launching a similar application for? You know, I'm thinking of the limits on the amount of people who can congregate, for example. Are there any other areas that you would like to address?
So it's an interesting question, because we discussed this quite a lot the past couple of weeks, is what's remaining of the lockdown regulations that we sort of have a big issue with. I think the biggest concern is the fact that from these national state of disaster regulations, a bunch of other directives flow. For example, the Minister of Sports and Culture recently promulgated new directives which require people attending sporting events to be vaccinated. Now, the discussion then would be, if the regulations of the state of disaster falls away, then the directives issued in terms of the state of disaster also falls away. So it really is a broader pyramid, and the pyramid sort of foundation at this point are these regulations in terms of the state of disaster. So it's not necessarily that they're particular one or certain aspects of it that are problematic, but to be honest, the entire thing in itself is problematic. But you mentioned the prohibition on or limitation rather on gatherings. That's obviously one major thing. And then just the inconsistencies. Why is it all right for 4,000 people to gather to watch a football match, but you only have a certain number of people who may attend a funeral? It simply, you know, it doesn't make sense, and it is contradictory in the end of the day. So it's probably worth our while to look into other aspects, and we are looking into other litigation to slowly try to chip away in sort of this behemoth that's been created over the past 20 months.
Daniël Eloff, thank you very much for joining us on the CRA channel. Let's hand over to you, our viewers. Do you think that the curfew is rational? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.